classroom. My name is Baptiste, and I am an assistant professor at the University of Le Havre in France. Le Havre is home to a major French port that you can see here. And this is why today I am going to discuss what lawyers can do to help reducing the greenhouse gases emissions from the shipping sector. So in this video, I would like to do three things. One, explain why I chose to discuss this topic. Two, give you a quick overview of the different legal tools that exist to deal with this problem. And third, I would like to focus on one specific piece of legislation that is new and important, namely the 2023 EU regulation called FuelEU Maritime. So in my introduction, I want to ask two questions. First, what am I talking about exactly when I say greenhouse gases emissions from the shipping sector? Second, why does it matter to discuss this problem? So what are we talking about? What I want to discuss is the impact on climate of a specific economic activity, which is called shipping. Shipping may be a confusing term because today it often means transport of goods in general. When you buy something online, you often have to pay shipping costs or choose between shipping options. But it does not mean that what you bought will be delivered to you by sea. Originally, though, shipping did mean specifically transporting goods using a ship. And in legal English today, shipping law is often used to describe what in other languages is called maritime law or navigation law. Anyway, the shipping sector means the industry of transport of goods by sea. But by extension, most of what I will say today is also applicable to the cruise ship industry, which involves transport of persons by sea, mostly for pleasure. I want to clear up another point. What interests me is specifically greenhouse gases emissions from shipping. Ships can harm the environment in many different ways, and usually when you think of pollution in ships, you think of direct harm caused by ships to the ocean, such as when a ship causes an oil spill. Marine pollution is an important topic, of course, but it does not have a direct relation to climate change, which is what we are discussing today. And so I come to my second question. Why does it matter to discuss greenhouse gases emissions from the shipping sector? In a nutshell, because the shipping industry is a major source of greenhouse gases emissions. Let me give you a few facts to paint the picture. Fact 1. According to the UN Conference on Trade and Development, the share of international trade carried by sea is around 80% in terms of volume and over 70% in terms of value. In other words, the vast majority of goods transported internationally are transported by sea. Shipping is the backbone of international trade. Fact 2. According to the International Maritime Organization, the share of greenhouse gas emissions from shipping in global emissions is roughly 3%. In itself, it may be hard to tell if this number is good or bad. And in fact, shipping companies like to point out that maritime transport is in some way naturally greener than other modes of transportation, because ships emit much less greenhouse gases by ton transported than airplanes, trucks, or even trains. However, and that is fact 3, there are serious reasons to be concerned. Current trends are worrying. The share of the shipping sector in all emissions increased from 276% in 2012 to 289% in 2018. The International Maritime Organization projects that this could become much worse in the future. In 2050, shipping emissions could reach between 19 and 130% of 2008 emissions. Consequently, the share of emissions from the shipping sector could reach 10% of all emissions. The reason is that even if individual ships produce less emissions since 2009, the volume of maritime traffic keeps growing at a steady pace. So something needs to happen in the shipping sector, but there are major challenges. One important challenge is the lack of technology that would allow for truly green shipping right now. Most ships built today are still powered by fossil fuels. A number of companies have invested in LNG-powered vessels, but the reduction in emissions is just about 20%, while there is also strong suspicions that methane leaks mean these ships are not as green as they seem. Another challenge is the life cycle of ships and investment strategies by shipping companies. A ship takes several years to build and usually remains in service for at least 20 or 25 years, which means decisions made now have very long-term effects. To give you an extreme example, here's a picture of the Arthur M. Anderson, a famous lake freighter that has been in operation for 72 years. I hope you get the big picture now. So let me come to my second part of this video and ask an important question. What does the law say about greenhouse gases emissions from the shipping sector? A wide variety of legal instruments already have been designed to address the problem of greenhouse gases emissions from the shipping sector. I want to give you a quick overview. But before I do that, a quick note about the enforcement of all the rules I'm about to mention. You have to understand that ships are controlled routinely in ports for safety and environmental reasons. I cannot go into detail, but generally, failure to comply with regulations laid down by the International Maritime Organization may lead states to restrict the use of a ship by its owner. And if a ship cannot legally go at sea or cannot legally sail in specific areas, it will become useless for its owners. So shipping companies better follow existing regulations. There are 4 types of rules relating to emissions by ships, mostly laid down by the International Maritime Organization and integrated into the International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships, known as MARPOL. So, first type of rule, rules regarding ship design and ship operation. One instance of that is the Energy Efficiency Design Index, EEDI. It requires the use of more energy-efficient equipment and engines for the design of new ships. It requires a minimum energy efficiency level per ton of cargo transported for different ship type and size segments. Another example is the Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plan. It requires ship owners and operators to establish a plan in order to optimize the performance of the ship. In other words, they must give guidance to the crew on how to use the ship in a more efficient way, for instance by optimizing the speed of the ship or the routes it travels. Second type of rules. Various reporting obligations have been created for ship owners in relation to greenhouse gases emissions. The point of these obligations is to lay ground for actual limits to emissions. The idea is that you need to have data on emissions before you try and cap them. One example of such an obligation is the Carbon Intensity Indicator, CII, created by the IMO again. It measures how efficiently a ship transports goods or passengers and is given in grams of CO2 emitted per ton of cargo transported. I should also mention the IMO's data collection system known as DCS and the EU's Monitoring, Reporting and Verification Regulation, or MRV. Both of them require ship operators to record and report the fuel oil consumption of their ships. Third type of rules, cap-and-trade systems. Under these systems, ship owners are allocated a limited quantity of emissions that they can emit. There is one example of this. Since January of this year, emissions from all large ships entering EU ports are covered by the EU's emission trading system known as ETS. Such systems are sometimes criticized as allowing polluters to pay to pollute without really inciting them to make efforts to produce less emissions. Fourth type of rules, those established regarding the use of fuels. And the most important one is the FuelEU Maritime Regulation, which I will now turn to. So what is FuelEU Maritime? Its official name is Regulation 2023-1805 of the European Parliament and of the Council of 13th of September 2023 on the use of renewable and low-carbon fuels in the maritime transport and amending Directive 2009-16 EC. Why focus on it? Because it is arguably the most serious attempt at regulating greenhouse gases emissions from ships ever implemented. So how does it work? In a nutshell, it regulates the type of fuels that ships may use. It is designed to encourage a progressive transition out of fossil fuels and towards low-carbon fuels. The end goal is to make emissions from the shipping sector compatible with targets set in the Paris Agreements. The regulation is extremely complex, but I'll try to outline the key points. So let's start with the main purpose of the regulation. Reduce the greenhouse gas intensity of fuels used by ships. The idea is to look at the quantity of greenhouse gases emissions required to produce a set amount of energy when you use a specific type of fuel. To be precise, greenhouse gas intensity is measured in grams of carbon dioxide equivalent by megajoule. The regulation sets targets for decreasing intensity based on the average intensity recorded in 2020. Remember the MRV regulation I mentioned earlier? The 2020 baseline was set thanks to data recorded in application of that regulation. Look at the chart to see how progressive the decrease of carbon intensity is. Arguably, the first series target is only 2045, with an expected reduction of 62% compared to 2020. Now let's look at the scope of the regulation. These targets do not apply to all ships, and they do not apply to all the fuel used by the ships that fall under the scope of the regulation. FuelEU Maritime applies to all ships above 5,000 gross tons that serves the purpose of transporting passengers or cargo for commercial purposes. Some types of ships are excluded, and the most significant category exempt from the regulation is ships used by the fishing industry. Warships are also excluded, as is standard in maritime law. So, what type of ship are we talking about? For reference, here is the MF Bastøy 3, a ferry in operation in Norway. It has a gross tonnage of about 7,000 and can transport about 500 passengers, so that's roughly the size of the smaller ships that will be covered by the regulation. By comparison, today's largest classes of container ships, such as the MSC Loreto, exceed 230,000 gross tons. Even for those ships above 5,000 tons, the regulation will not apply systematically. The carbon intensity rules only apply in certain situations when ships travel certain routes. The regulation applies to the entirety of the energy used on voyages from a port of call in an EU member state to a port of call also located in an EU member state. But it only applies to half the energy used on voyages departing from or arriving at a port of call located in an EU member state when the other end of the voyage is a port of call located in a third country. What happens if a ship fails to comply with the regulation? Article 25 provides that member states may issue expulsion orders against non-compliant ships, but that is an extreme case. Sanctions are chiefly financial, with the regulation providing formulas to calculate penalties. Are these sanctions adequate? That is only one of the many questions raised by the FuelEU regulation. You will see in the report by NGO Transport and Environment that is part of the reading assignments that these financial penalties may not be very dissuasive. So please follow the instructions regarding reading assignments to prepare for debates about what the shortcomings of the FuelEU regulation may be. I hope we can discuss what the shipping sector needs to do to keep its greenhouse gases emissions at levels compatible with temperature goals set in the Paris Agreement. Thank you for listening, and see you in class.